Okay, so now we've kind of covered the general strengths and weaknesses of the armies and the tactical ones. We've established the British, like the Americans just need to survive. And what is the British criteria for winning? Like getting the colonies back in
Just
and
destroy Washington. Okay, so I'd say if I had to put it in a nutshell, destroy Washington completely. You have to destroy, capture Washington and the
yeah,
army, but without doing so in a way that completely alienates the colonies.
and
So, so no committing atrocities,
yeah.
no random destruction of cities or of property. I think that's what the British have to do, and the Americans have to just hold on.
Yeah. Yeah. But then what about peace afterwards? Do the British have an objective for that? Or is it just like, let's deal with the war first and then, because the problems are going to be the same. They're not, I don't see how they fix the problems.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
Westward
that's
expansion is still a problem.
paradox.
No taxation is still a problem. Funding it is still a problem. Putting the army there is still a problem. I don't see how any of these things have gone away.
Yeah, but there are larger security issues for Britain, right? It's got its assets, colonial assets in the West Indies,
Yeah.
and an independent America, particularly one which the British just let go,
Yeah.
would be a tremendous dent on British prestige. It could lead to other colonial rebellions in other parts of the empire, potentially, maybe. And the real danger, I think that this is the worst situation for the British is some kind of French Franco-American alliance in which France regains its foothold in the Americas, is able to establish bases in which it can attack British assets in the Caribbean. I
So
think that's at stake too.
so exactly what happens then, yeah.
Yeah, exactly what.
The
Well,
worst case scenario for the British is Saratoga happens and this happens.
not quite, because the French don't end up in America. I mean, they don't end up. Well, yeah, they don't lose the Caribbean. They don't lose all of their assets there.
No.
There's some back and forth there, but
yeah, I don't think
it could be a lot.
Would the Americans have let the French back in? I don't think they would have done because they're, they haven't quite got manifest destiny at this point, but they're certainly thinking about it. They're going west and taking everything.
Yeah, it would be a concern though, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Likewise with the Spanish.
I still don't know if the British have a proper plan. I'm not sure they would have seen rebellion in the other colonies as coming because I think they would have thought non-white people wouldn't have had the capacity to do it in that time period. Because the Haitian Revolution hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
I think after the Haitian Revolution, that changes everything because then they go, oh, actually, people might rebel against white authority. But because it hadn't yet happened, I don't think that would have been in their mind. If that was in their mind, do you think if they really believed that, do you think they would have freed the slaves in the South?
Well, I think it's a different set of circumstances. I'm not sure about that. But it is to say that what the point I'm trying to emphasize, I guess, is that it's not simply possession of the 13 colonies that's on Britain's mind.
Yeah,
it has its imperial interests at stake as well, and it has its financial interest in the Caribbean. I mean, the Caribbean is more important.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that they're factoring that in until Saratoga happens and the French come in, and then I think obviously that becomes very real. I'm not sure I still think at the beginning of this, they think this is a small war. They're going to crush it and put it down. I don't think they think this is going to escalate into a new 7 years war or global conflict.
Right, which it does. I mean, I think it gets very bad for Britain. Britain is alone. Britain is essentially, the European powers either ally against or declare themselves neutral.
Yeah. Did Portugal not join us? They're usually on our side for absolutely everything. Did they?
No, they were neutral.
They sat this one out. They're even like, no.
Well, I imagine Portugal. See, the problem for Portugal is that it's right next to Spain.
Yeah.
And Spain is able to threaten Portugal.
Yeah.
So I imagine for the Portuguese, they have to be neutral in order not to antagonize their Spanish neighbors.
So the Prussians not even get involved in this. They're not even bothered.
Prussians are neutral.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So it really is a full-on gang up on the British.
It's terrible. It's actually from a foreign policy perspective, it is the worst, probably one of the worst outcomes that could ever have imagined once France and Spain join the war. But we're jumping ahead. This is a few years later.
We declare war on the Dutch.
Think
that's really weird. But never mind. All right, so yeah, let's go back. So we've done Bunker Hill significance. We'll jump back. Let's jump back into the escape from Long Island. So when obviously the British land in New York, they go to New York obviously because New York and Philadelphia are quite loyal. Pennsylvania, sorry. And it's quite interesting that the British hold all the major port cities for the whole war, and it makes no difference. They hold Charleston, they hold Savannah pretty much after they take them both. They hold New York. The only port town they don't hold is Boston. Is that significant? Is it significant the Americans hold one port open?
Yeah. Again, this is your lack of inflection for questions.
Yeah, sorry. Is it important that they hold that one port open?
Well, they're not really fighting in New England, are they? The British haven't gone. They're not. I think the British strategy is to cut off New England.
Yeah.
From the rest of the colonies to sort of cauterize it.
We should take into account the Americans. One thing we should talk about is the Americans do after Bunker Hill. They do invade Canada, and they do take Montreal, and they get all the way up to Quebec, but they fail to take Quebec because the British are able to supply it by sea. And again, it's like all these wars. Like Quebec is the fundamental one. In the 7 Years' War, they take it. In the War of Russian Secession, the British don't take it. And in the War of Independence, the Americans don't take it. And then they get rolled back. And the British roll them back out of Canada. How important is it that the Americans don't capture Canada? How much of a difference would that have made if they'd taken Quebec?
How much what? Sorry? I missed that.
How much difference would that have made if they'd have taken Quebec, if the Americans had been successful in their invasion of Canada?
Oh, I think that would have been very annoying. Yeah. I think that obviously that may have diverted Burgoyne.
Yeah. Wouldn't have launched his little mission that year. Wouldn't have been there. Wouldn't have been
Burgoyne failed anyway.
In his campaign if they'd have taken Quebec. So perhaps failing to take Quebec was actually beneficial for them because they get Burgoyne's incompetent southern meanders.
I think you're very hard on Burgoyne, James.
you can defend him. I'll give you the case against. You can give me the case when we get to Saratoga.
Yeah, I think the consequence, if they had taken Quebec, there would have been problems on the American side too.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
because they're very far away.
And the French Quebecois probably are not keen on being sucked into Great Awakening New England.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you go.
I said, do you think it's the great irony that it's the French Quebecois, the Dutch in New York, the Germans in Pennsylvania, and like the Swedes in Delaware that are most loyal to the crown?
Ironic in what sense?
Well, it's all the foreign colonists. So the most loyal to the British crown are the foreign colonists, and the most resistant are the British ones.
No, I don't. I guess it's ironic in sense, but I think there is something more politically independent in the British mentality, right?
Yeah, for
There's
sure.
something more assertive. I think if you live in an absolute monarchy, for example, in France, you're probably less mindful of your rights as a French subject.
Yeah.
If you have your rights as a British citizen, then that's a completely different ballgame.
The British they rebelled, saying they were more British than the British, and the British are currently using lots of foreign soldiers, foreign ideas, foreign laws. They might have a point.
Yeah.
And so it's like the battle for the soul of Britishness. So okay, they fail in Canada. We'll come back to that when we deal with Gentleman Johnny and his Southern March. So we'll jump down to New York. So they go to New York because it's the most loyalist controlled area. They lose New York, they retreat out. How vital is it that Washington escapes from Long Island and Howe doesn't take him? And how much of a mistake, how much do we blame that on Howe, and how much is on Washington's escape?
I think that's huge. I think that's absolutely huge. I think the expectation in Britain was that the war would end quickly. This is not the only time people make that bad bet, right?
Yeah.
So there's so many wars. World War One. You might think of recently the Ukraine, even the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah.
Everybody thought it was going to be over in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
And if it had been, I think if if Howe had taken the initiative and not just defeated Washington but pursued him and tried and destroyed the army,
Yeah.
then we would potentially have arrived at a favorable peace settlement for Britain.
Yeah.
Potentially. But I think the fact that Howe failed to do that, Washington succeeds in retreating and holds on, now brings the war into a new stage, I think.
Yeah, and Washington was considering surrendering in that winter as well, because they thought the army wasn't about that, and the Valley Forge winter, they were like, this is really bad. Obviously, 1777 goes badly for them. They get the little victory at the end of 1776 after they retreat away, where they get the how much do you think that Washington's Christmas attack on Trenton and Princeton and taking those two, and like again going round Howe, because Howe didn't leave a proper garrison to defend there. There's another mistake of Howe. So Bunker Hill, the evacuation was Howe's error. Pulling them out, didn't hold the hill. I think not capturing Washington was Howe's problem. I think this one was Howe's issue as well. He allowed them to, and Washington getting those victories. I mean, admittedly, it was something that wasn't normal attacking on Christmas Day.
Well, I think, yeah, in terms of the victories, this is in New Jersey, right, Trenton?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think it's that important from the British perspective.
Yeah.
I don't think that Washington's attacks, he has a couple of very minor victories, sure. I don't think that's seriously
the first victories. Because Bunker
No, okay, but I'm about to get to that. So
yeah,
I think that from the British perspective, it's not particularly, it doesn't damage British military power in any significant way. But from the point of view of the Americans, I think it's very, very important.
Yeah.
Because they're on the verge that the morale is very low. They've suffered this tremendous defeat, right? They're in retreat.
Yeah.
Armies have a habit of disintegrating in retreat when they retreat.
Yeah.
Right. And the fact that Washington could just scrape together a couple of victories, I think from the American perspective meant that they had a chance.
Yeah.
And that there was, that people were willing, soldiers were willing to stick with it.
Yeah.
So from the American perspective, very important. From the British perspective, not particularly.
No, they had a couple of good little mini wins. So because after 1776, the Canada invasion fails and they're being rolled back, and Carleton chases them down, but they end up with a gun, like Benedict Arnold, future traitor, but war hero until he became a traitor. He created a gunboat fleet to prevent them crossing one of the lakes, and that stopped the British from moving down into New York and Boston in that winter. Right. If they'd have got that army across in 1776, and with Washington in full retreat from Long Island, could they have squashed the rebellion there?
Potentially, yeah, potentially. But again, I mean, this is Howe's decision, right? It's very hard. Yeah. This happens all. It's very easy to sit. It's like watching a football match. You say you're shouting at the television. You're saying, "Why didn't you do that?"
Yeah.
Well, when you're actually on the field, it's different. So. Yeah. There are all sorts of considerations, and there are circumstances in which pursuit could lead to destruction too.
Yeah.
So when there's a lot at stake, the tendency is to be conservative. Maybe it's understandable. I didn't get the impression that Howe was particularly incompetent. I think he was sort of average, really.
You think he was just unlucky? But he did let Washington escape. You could have had him. You could maybe, and he didn't reinforce Gentleman Johnny's southern march down.
Yeah, that's right. That was a big mistake. Is that? Yeah, that was a big problem too. But I think we'll get to that.
There were lots of how Bunker Hill was Howe's, Trenton, like Long Island escape, Saratoga. It's like who's more to blame, Burgoyne? Because they can get questioned on Burgoyne or Howe. Like Howe was obviously in charge of the overall strategy, but I don't think Howe is as individually as incompetent as Burgoyne. But like when you're going to be a case of
here you go, you've just got this animus against Burgoyne.
He's an idiot. We're going to deal with him after. I'm not putting my I'm not going anywhere in the middle here. I'm going straight out to be like, guy's a moron. It's just a question whether Howe's overall strategic incompetence is worse. So there are some definite errors from British generals. Yeah, like in terms of strategy. No, I'm not sure
he could have lost it. He could have lost the battle against Washington. He could have lost the battle against Washington.
Who?
He
How?
didn't. Yeah.
He wouldn't have done. Washington doesn't win battles. When does he win a battle? I don't see Washington winning that one. The Americans, but at this point, his army was still amateur. You know what I mean? They hadn't had their professional training in Valley Forge until winter of 1777, so they're not able to stand toe to toe British forces, I think.
And then, yeah, I mean, there's another point here too we should mention about how something may have been able to do and doesn't, and that's march on Philadelphia before the winter.
Yes.
Or before going into winter quarters.
So you think more? So yeah, because if he'd have taken Philadelphia before Washington got the rally at Trenton, maybe that would have had the moral knockout.
Yeah, maybe.
It's interesting.
Although as it turns out, you know, it's not decisive really to have Washington, to have Philadelphia, is it?
No, and we'll talk, because obviously in 1777 they capture it. And like this is important.
That's right. So that's the next year.
Yeah, the Americans have been rolled back because 1776 at the end of it, they get the little victory in Trenton. They managed to roll back the British invasion from Canada. 1776 has started quite well, and then it was like ending really badly for them. 1777 continues that. The Howe takes Philadelphia, but the government evacuates Philadelphia, and Howe kind of takes Philadelphia because in European war, if you take the capital city, that's the end. You know, if you think of like, you know, where every time Paris has fallen to the Germans, they surrender. When Berlin fell, they surrender. It's just the usual way of doing things. So he's like, we took Philadelphia, end of the war. And the Americans...
But it's actually, when you look at it from that perspective, it's actually, in some ways, it's strangely a kind of advantage that that the colonies are so disunited.
Yeah.
Like that they're all independent entities. Yeah. All acting on their own initiative. It means that if you take one of their cities and the government flees, well, they're just still going to carry on as they did before. They're just going to be in a different place, right?
Yeah.
It's not like if you took Paris and you completely destroy the supply lines or whatever, and then it's game over, you know.
I don't think the Americans have ever put the same. Yeah, maybe that's because maybe you're right. Maybe because they were 13 colonies initially, they've never put that same stock into caring about their. Because even when even the War of 1812, we burnt down the White House.
And you did. The British did that. That's an incredible episode.
British burned down the White House in 1812.
British burned. Yeah. Doesn't do very much.
No, it doesn't. They didn't care. Like the symbolic event, and like all they did was like we bombarded all their cities in 1812, and they just moved all the capital cities inland. That's why none of the capital cities are the port cities anymore. They're inland towns because they're like, well, if the British are going to bombard them with ships, we'll just change the capital city. Now you couldn't imagine Europeans changing their capital. You know, that just wouldn't happen. They're so attached to this historical sense of stuff. Whereas the Americans are just like, yeah, whatever it takes to win. So it's like that. I think that's that American mentality. It's like we do what it takes to win. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But so obviously they don't surrender. So it obviously has no real impact. But I'm interested now in your point. Do you think it would have been different if they'd have captured it before Trenton?
Captured Philadelphia?
Yeah, in 1776 or in 1777.
Possibly. I think we're in a decisive moment here.
Yeah.
I think we're in a decisive moment where if Howe had a lot more energy and initiative, as some very good generals have had in history, right?
Yeah.
Like a Rommel, maybe.
Or even like
or Robert E. Lee or something.
Wolfe and Amherst in the 7 Years' War, because the British didn't capture Quebec in the War of Austrian Succession, and Pitt made them appoint much more aggressive generals, and they did more aggressive attacks, and they won. And it seems like they've almost gone back to the War of Austrian Succession tactics of slowly.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think I'd say number one, destroy Washington at Long Island. That would have been, that's the biggest missed opportunity, I think.
Yeah.
And to some extent, perhaps marching on Philadelphia. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. Would it have destroyed American morale completely? Could Washington have conjured up some kind of minor victory to hang on? I don't know. But it would have been bad.
If they'd have captured Philadelphia, he might not have got the win at Trenton, which again would have then meant he doesn't have any morale boosting victories. So even if that hadn't knocked the Americans out, I think if Gates won at Saratoga and Washington's got no victories, I think Gates takes over the Continental Army, and then I think it's a different game.
Yeah.
Because he would have had the only victory against the British, and it would have been harder for the Continental Congress.
But this hasn't happened yet.
No, it happens next year. But if they'd lost Philadelphia and he hadn't had Trenton,
exactly, that's right.
It would have been really important.
That's right.
They take it. Howe's like, I took the capital, war's over, and the Americans are just like, no, it isn't. And do you think this is where they have different? Because then, do you think the British just thought they were fighting? I think this is where the British realized they're not fighting a standard war. And I think their problem is maybe that's why they didn't take Washington, why they didn't do more stuff, because they still thought they're fighting a standard war where you beat an army in the field and you win. It's like almost like they think the Americans aren't playing cricket. It's like you're not standing and fighting, you're not having a proper fight, you're not just surrendering when your capital's taken, you're not doing all the things you're supposed to do in war. And the Americans are like,
we're fighting. Possibly, but I also think that there are military and logistic considerations for any general.
Yeah.
And some generals just are a lot more conservative, a lot more cautious. They don't want to risk, because maybe, Howe could have had some kind of reversal if he hadn't been prepared. I don't know. Maybe he was concerned about that. Maybe his men weren't in a good condition to do that. Who knows?
Do you think Howe and Burgoyne
it can also be personality? It can be personality. What's that?
Do you think if Howe and Burgoyne had been in opposite positions, it would have worked out? Because where Howe needed to be bold,
I think Burgoyne would have got there.
Burgoyne was like
several years later.
Well, he was
That's true, actually. Yeah, but he moved very slowly because of those crates of champagne
and his piano. Don't forget the piano.
Did he have a piano with him?
He brought a grand piano, so
that's how you win.
So his wife played the piano. So they carried it through the forest paths and across the lake. Yeah. So now obviously they've captured Philadelphia. It's not done anything. The Americans are like, we don't care. We're going to keep fighting anyway. So now we get to your man Burgoyne and their tripartite.
Gentleman Johnny. Do you know he loved writing plays?
Did he write down? He stopped to write in the forest as well. He got inspiration from some random place. So Gentleman Johnny, I'll go through the history of it, and then you can defend him. So if you wanted, so they had the idea of a three-pronged attack, which is obviously the three-pronged attack is what we'll see in Unit 1 is what they used to knock out the Quebecois in the 7 Years' War, but they tried a different one. So they were like, we're going to come upon Boston from 3 different angles. Come up from New York with, I think Howe was sending Clinton up from New York. Yeah. McClinton doesn't leave, which is important because he decides it's not worth it. St. Ledger was coming in from the west and he's defeated. So I think Burgoyne knew Howe wasn't coming, but I don't think he knew St. Ledger had been beaten in the Mohawk Valley. And Burgoyne decides he's going to pack up a piano, creates a champagne, like ridiculous wagon things.
Can we just focus on
this? Is very important because it's Canada, where you can't fight in the winter. So he leaves a little bit late, thinking they're going to get to the lake and use the boats to cross it and get down to the fort. So and this is where Benedict Arnold has the idea that why don't we just burn the entire lot of boats on that lake? So Benedict Arnold set fire to all the boats, burnt them down. So when time Gentleman Johnny's like slow-ass train gets down to the lake, they've then got to rebuild boats because they don't have any because Benedict Arnold burnt them all, which is quite an important strength. Benedict Arnold, I mean, if he hadn't become a traitor, he would have been such an American hero. And then he gets passed up for promotion, like Washington. So this is like the side, like the same things, then turn side. It's exactly like the thing. Only Washington turned to the winning side. So Arnold burns down the boats. They can't cross the lake. They get across. Burgoyne eventually gets across the lake and gets to Ticonderoga. Makes a couple of other mistakes upon the way. He declares that he's slow moving, leaves late in the season. He takes Ticonderoga, the key fort. Could have stayed in Ticonderoga, decides, no, I'm going to march on Boston, even though it's really late in the winter season, and decides to leave and continue marching onwards away from where he would have been able to get supplies. Too late to get back to Canada because it's winter now, so he's kind of there. He hasn't got any support. He also issues an order that Native American allies can attack villages in their usual traditional senses. And there's an attack slash rape.
That's one way of putting it.
There's a attack slash rape of a young woman, Jane McCrae. Okay. And the Americans use this as propaganda that the British are letting the Native Americans loose upon the populations, which of course causes a huge surge in militia volunteering because they're like, you're now bringing the Native American warfare onto that soil. So Burgoyne does that as well while marching south. So not only does he fail to bring enough supplies and stuff, and he then exacerbates the problem by increasing the number of enemies he's going to face. And then, of course, he marches into battle, doesn't have enough supplies, Gates cuts him off, and he's forced to surrender all of his men because they do not have enough supplies to survive that. And that is huge because, of course, that means that the British have lost a huge army and the Americans have got a massive win. And that changes everything. 5,000 British prisoners were taken to Boston. They had to give up their arms and promise not to fight on anymore in the war. The British don't have the numbers to replace those kind of losses. And it's a huge symbolic defeat because this victory without actually fighting is the punch in the nose of the bully that brings the French into the war effectively. So do you want to make a case for Mr. Burgoyne?
Absolutely, yeah. I think Burgoyne ranks, along the great generals of, like the Duke of Marlborough, maybe Erwin Rommel.
Yeah.
Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny, and he's a literary man. I studied literature. I've always got time for generals that write plays.
He's got a lot more time to write after he surrenders because he's not able to fight on anymore.
Yeah. It's worth. I mean, I was fascinated by some of these details. He has a baggage train that has 30 vehicles just for himself.
Yeah, and a piano. Took a piano through the forest.
So it takes 3 weeks to cover 23 miles.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, that's not great. Yes, big mistake with the Native Americans. Although, obviously, that's the British more generally have been using this tactic. So I don't think Burgoyne is the only one. It's not Burgoyne's idea to do this. And it's worth noting that he has a quarrel. In Burgoyne's defense, James.
Yeah.
He has a quarrel with the Indians after this horrific event. This woman who gets scalped, Jane McCrae, and the Indians just they leave. They just go away.
Well, which is even worse because you've managed to get the militia and then you've lost them as allies, which is a strategic double blunder because you've now caused a problem for not even any gain.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. There's issues with the foraging. He has a foraging. So Burgoyne, I think he's just very unlucky. He has this other, he has a foraging party. So a foraging party, obviously, you send off your soldiers to go and collect supplies. Yeah. But when they're foraging, they're actually quite vulnerable.
Yeah,
they can get ambushed. And so Burgoyne's foraging party gets ambushed and 600 are killed.
Yeah.
Right. That's bad. That's quite a lot of men. And then he sends out a relief party to rescue them. Yeah. And then they get ambushed. so
I think the problem with Burgoyne is he thinks he's the Duke of Marlborough, but he's not.
So then, so Burgoyne's choice. So, Howe's choice is, should I stay put or should I go and pursue Washington?
Yeah.
And I think we all agree in hindsight, which is, we should go and pursue Washington. Yeah. Now, Burgoyne makes exactly the opposite mistake.
Yeah, should have stayed in Ticonderoga or in Canada.
He should have gone back. He should have gone back with his piano and bottles of champagne.
He should have left the piano behind and gone back.
No. Instead, he doesn't. He decides to just, hack away, right?
Yeah.
And look, to be fair, as you know, I'm inclined to defend Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny. He is promised help.
Yeah.
So he expects. So he expects.
But the generals don't like each other, do they? So they're not inclined to help.
No, I think there's there are
there's personal problems about hierarchy and who's in control and who is the top general, and so they didn't really work in accord. There was a lot of uncoordinated work because they just didn't like each other personally.
Yeah. So look, if you were a Burgoyne defender, you could blame a lot of this on Clinton, right?
Or on Howe, because Howe was ordered in command.
Yeah. Well, Howe. Yeah.
I just don't think they're going to ask a question where Clinton is an option. So I think it's always going to be Howe or Burgoyne who's more significant.
I see. Okay, so that's a good practical consideration. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Howe and then Clinton under Howe.
Yeah.
First of all, delays leaving to help Burgoyne, and then when he does eventually leave, he doesn't even get. Well, he captures a couple of forts, but he doesn't do anything that seriously affects Gates's position. Right, Gates is he's dug in, he's ready to fight.
And Benedict Arnold is a brilliant general, and he's at that point still on the American side. He's a brilliant tactician.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. On the American side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so Burgoyne attacks. So Burgoyne thinks he can break through but Gates's lines and somehow get through right to the other side.
Which is
he does this.
Yeah. Where do you think he's going? He's going deeper and deeper into enemy territory, anyways.
Yeah, and this let's just say it doesn't go very well.
No. And then of course, this is. Oh, you want to add some more? I was going to say this is really important.
I want to. You know, I think I was horrified by what happened with the tea in last episode, and now there's something horrifying that Congress does.
Yeah.
Did you read this?
No. What did Congress do?
Basic? Well, so Burgoyne he eventually surrenders.
Yeah.
Right, but the thing is that Gates, right, the opposing general, but Gates is under pressure because Gates knows that Clinton is not that far away.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, Gates doesn't have the time to really impose horrible terms on Burgoyne.
Yeah.
So they basically come to a kind of gentleman agreement.
Yeah.
Gentleman's agreement, and very 18th century style, in which they sort of say, well, no hard feelings. The British can march back to Boston,
yeah,
and take ship back to England. They can fight in whatever other war they want to, as long as they never come back to America.
Yeah,
that's the agreement.
But that's 5,000 men lost for the British, which is a lot.
That's 5,000 men lost for the British on America, and maybe Burgoyne thought that's not too bad. But James, this is the icing on the cake. Guess what happens to Burgoyne's troops?
Where do they fight then? Do they go to the Caribbean?
No, they don't even leave. Congress basically finds an excuse not to honor Gates's
they detain
terms,
them for the
and
war,
they detain them.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, they detain them in a camp. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
How duplicitous is that? That's not a good start.
But do you think this is the problem?
That's not
the
cricket.
British are fighting this gentleman's European war, and the Americans are fighting a proper war of a modern. The Americans are fighting in a more modern style.
I don't know what Gates thought about this. I mean, Gates is the one that he's basically, he
doesn't like
Continental Congress.
They've made Washington leader and not him, and he thinks he should be leader. You've got problems in both sides. The generals don't like each other.
Yeah.
And you've got Benedict Arnold turns traitor because he's not promoted. I mean, you've got all sorts of issues on the leadership on both sides.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the end of Burgoyne.
I think Washington's the only one who wouldn't have been duplicitous. This is really important. I'll bring this in because this brings in the external factors, and we'll talk about how important they are, because we've got to make sure we cover the last parts in the last bit. We run out of time. So obviously Saratoga is really key because that's the key that brings France into the war. The French realize the British are vulnerable. They can take them in this. This is an opportunity. The British are definitely going to be tied down now. They've lost 5,000 men. They can't get anywhere. And the French enter the war. They negotiate with the French. They enter it. And this changes everything because it makes the British Empire vulnerable, because the Spanish come in a year later. So the Spanish don't come in until a year afterwards. And then Britain declares war on Holland, I'm guessing because they were already fighting each other. So now you've got the British Navy, which is built to be able to be better than the second and third best navies in the world, is now up against the second, third, and fourth biggest navies in the world, three other big maritime powers, and is now spread out across the whole world. So this is now massively escalating the costs, which, as we know, was a problem for them in the 7 Years' War, and it's now again a global war, which is going to cost loads. I think this is vitally important because it threatens the French West Indies, and it's no coincidence that in the key Battle of Yorktown, when the French Navy is vital for moving American supplies up and down the coast, and then the French Navy blocks off Cornwallis so he can't get out, which means they had to surrender again, and becomes the second victory they win without actually fighting anyone. But I think that British Navy would not have been in the Caribbean at that point in that war if the French were not threatening the Caribbean. And the Navy that helps win the Battle of Yorktown was on the way to the Caribbean. So the British Navy was waiting for it there. Although you could have argued tactically they could have headed it off at Yorktown and knocked it out, but they were worried about where, they didn't realize that the French Navy would turn up in North America first. I think it's really difficult in the age of, we don't have modern communications. It's quite hard to strategically calculate everything. But I think that the British are spread out. They're vulnerable. They lose Minorca to the Spanish. Gibraltar's under threat. The French Caribbean is under threat. India's under threat. Everything is under threat. And I think this basically is why the British go in the end we're going to give America independence. We need to concentrate on beating these other powers. We don't have the resources to spend on America. And I think the key is, would the Americans have won the war anyway? I think yes. You can tell me what you think, but I think the French entry into the war massively accelerates the end game.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think Saratoga. So Saratoga is where Burgoyne surrenders.
Yeah.
To Gates, and I think that Saratoga is the second inflection point.
Yeah.
In this conflict
after Long Island.
After Long Island.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it means Britain actually. So first of all, one good piece of evidence that this is decisive, this surrender.
Yeah.
Is that Britain actually tries to negotiate a peace when this happens.
Yeah.
And they offer to repeal the coercive acts.
Yeah.
They offer to renounce the right to tax the Americans completely.
Yeah.
And they say that the Americans can have their own army as long as, so that's basically everything short of independence.
It's the Commonwealth.
Right. Yeah, it's a Commonwealth. That's right.
It's the first offer of the Commonwealth, basically. You run your own affairs, but you stay part of our empire.
Right. And imagine if they'd offered those terms at the beginning of the war. Yeah. If that was if you can imagine, but go back to the
or even before they lost Saratoga.
Or even before then. Yeah. Maybe that would have really been tempting to the Americans. But the Americans say no. When our condition.
Do you think that's because they're negotiating with the French? Do you reckon the French said, turn down that peace offers, we'll get you something better because we're going to come into this?
I think that's entirely possible. I think they're in communication with the French. I'm sure they were for a long time because it's obvious.
Yeah, they were trying to get them in, but the French weren't interested because they thought the Americans were going to get caned and they were going to lose another 7.
That's right. And so this is another important point. So from the point of let's look at France for a second.
Yeah.
France, major power, right? And a first-rate military power.
Yeah, army far superior to Britain, and the army just weakened.
Far superior to Britain. On the other hand, the French treasury is not looking good.
No.
This is
what causes the French Revolution, them coming into this war.
Yeah, so it's very important to remember, when is the French Revolution? 1789.
Yeah, 89. Right? Yeah, it's just after
1789. So this is not far away. No. There are some serious problems in France.
Yeah.
Already. And so the French point of view is, well, obviously we want to stick it into the British. There's
and revenge for the 7 Years' War.
There's horrible British. We want to make life as difficult as possible for them, but we're not going to stick our neck out if the British somehow manage to defeat the Americans quickly. Then that's not going to be a good. Then you're going to have a war with Britain again, and be at a disadvantage. So France's policy is to wait and see, right? Wait and see whether the Americans actually are able to hold on or not. And Saratoga, the peace agreement at Saratoga, the Burgoyne surrender at Saratoga, basically is the catalyst, I think, for the French to decide, okay, the Americans are really in this. Yeah. And they're able to inflict some damage on the British, so we're going to go all in too.
Yeah, we can do this together, and the French must have known that the Spanish and Dutch were itching for it as well.
Yeah,
I don't think anyone enters this without knowing what the others' plans are, even if they come later.
Yeah, and so once the French enter, now we have a world war again. This is a war which is now going to echo throughout the empire.
Yeah.
Right. It'll be in India. It'll be in the Caribbean. It'll be in Africa.
Yeah.
In Europe.